Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Let's begin today's session of comprehensive news analysis with this first article that talks about India's decision to go ahead with the S 400 missile defense system from Russia, and in doing that, taking on a danger that the US might impose sanctions on India under its CATSA law. I'm sure all of you by now are aware about what the CATSA law is. CATSA stands for Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act. In very simple terms, this is a law passed by the US under which, if any country engages in defense or intelligence transactions with three countries, that is Russia, North Korea, and Iran, then those countries can face sanctions from the US. There are a total of 12 sanctions that can be imposed under the CATSA law. Now, because India is going ahead with its decision to buy the S 400 missile defense system, India may also have to face sanctions under this particular law. This is what this article talks about. That is, the choice that India has made. Is it worth it? And what dangers do we face because of this particular choice? Now, the decision to buy the S 400 missile defense system was not taken just now. It is a decision that officially was taken in 2018. So, obviously, India cannot now go back on that decision because this transaction is almost close to $5.5 billion. So rather than talking about whether we should go back on the decision or not, because that boat has sailed, let's look into the significance of this decision. Let's also look into whether there are other countries also that have the same kind of system, or is India the only country to buy it from Russia. Defense experts around the world have said that this defense system, that is the S 400 missile defense system, is by far the best available throughout the world. Even the US system does not come close to it. India is not the only country which has taken this system from Russia. Russia has promised this to Belarus. China, very interestingly, also will buy this system. Turkey and Saudi Arabia. Now, there are two very interesting things here. Number one, Turkey, after buying the S 400 missile defense system, has already faced sanctions from US. Although Turkey is a NATO ally of the US. So Turkey is a part of the NATO group where US also is one of the members. Even then, Turkey has faced those sanctions. Belarus in itself is a very interesting case study if you know about it. So Belarus, whose president is Lukashenko since 1994, is said to be the last dictatorship of Europe. So president of Belarus, who is more of a dictator, has complete support of Vladimir Putin. He has fake elections in the country and remains in power just with the support of Vladimir Putin. Interestingly, in fact, in May this year, there was a big international story that came up. There was a plane that was flying from Athens to Lithuania. It was going over Belarus, and the Belarus president sent its fighter planes, which forced this civilian airplane, a passenger airplane, to land in Belarus. Why? Because one of the people who were flying in this plane was a critic of the Belarus president. That person was forcefully taken out of the plane and was jailed in Belarus, and then the plane was allowed to go away, which led to a lot of controversy in Europe. Anyway, let's come back to India. Now, India in the past has witnessed many such requests from the US. For example, in the past, when US had to put sanctions on Iran and had to make sure that they don't earn money, US asked India to drop down its oil import from Iran, which we eventually did. Even though Iran used to give us the oil at the cheapest rate, it is also the closest oil supplying country to India, but still we accepted the request from the US. But this time around, we are not doing that. Now, why is that? Why is it that India is taking such a big danger? Number one, the sanctions under the CATSA law are not compulsory. That is, the law says that the US president can decide whether or not sanctions have to be put. So, if the US president, that is Joe Biden, decides that India is a very important ally of the US and its partnership is too important, then the US president can say, no, we will not put any sanctions on India. The condition is it can only happen if India promise the US that in the future we will try to reduce our dependence on the Russian weapons. India so far has not given any such assurance, but there are many people who believe that the US President Joe Biden, because of good relations with India through Quad, through Indo Pacific, might not put these sanctions on India. Now, India, on the other hand, has its own arguments. India says that the first discussion on buying the S 400 missile defense system took place at the BRICS summit in Goa in 2016. So, in the BRICS summit in 2016, when the leaders of all the BRICS nations were present, Prime Minister Modi had a one on one conversation, an informal conversation with Vladimir Putin, under which it was discussed that India will think about buying the S 400 system. The CATSA law, on the other hand, came into being in 2017. So, as per India's argument, our decision or our mind had been made up prior to the CATSA law, so it should not apply to India. Second argument is most of the surface to air missiles that India has are of Soviet origin. So if we have the S 400 missile defense system, it would be much more compatible with the existing weapons that India have. I'm sure you would know till 1990s Russia was by far the biggest supplier of weapons to India of all kinds because of various reasons. Number one, we had close relationship with the Soviet Union. They offered us good rates. They also offered us to take weapons by paying them in Indian rupee rather than paying them in the dollar. And they offered us top of the line weapons. However, since the LPG reforms, since India has opened up to the world, India has tried to diversify its defense buying. Since the beginning of the 21st century, our defense buying has tilted more towards the US than towards Russia. Right now, we have the Hercules aircraft on which Prime Minister Modi just landed at the Prayagraj Expressway. If you saw the news, we also have the Apache attack helicopters. We also have the Chinook helicopters from the US and a lot of other stuff. Now, under the CATSA law, there are 12 sanctions that can be imposed. Out of these 12, there are two main sanctions that India has to worry about. The first main sanction is prohibition on banking transaction, meaning that if India pays to a third country in dollars, it might become a problem because the US government might say that we will not exchange these dollars which are coming from India. The second problem is export sanctions that will have greater consequences because now India would not be able to export a lot of stuff to the US. Now we are hoping that these sanctions are not imposed. In fact, we have already paid a part of money to Russia for buying S 400. And interestingly, the money that we paid to Russia for buying S 400 was not in US dollar so that we can avoid this particular sanction. The first part was paid in rupee ruble agreement. Ruble, as you know, is a Russian currency. The US also offered us that if you don't buy the S 400 missile defense system, instead of that, we will offer you our own defense system, which is called the THAAD. So it would be interesting to have a small comparison between the S 400 and the THAAD system that belongs to the US. PAC 3 also is one of the systems that US has made. As you can see from these characteristics, the operational range, the maximum speed, the flight altitude, all of these indicate that S 400 is a more sophisticated and a better system as compared to the THAAD system of US, and that is why our policymakers are taking the choice to go ahead with this decision. In fact, as per the official communication, the first squadron of the S 400 will already be in India by the end of December. The second article that we have today is about Janjatiya Gaurav Divas, that is now being observed on 15th of November on the birthday of Birsa Munda, a well-known tribal leader who died in the year 1900 fighting against the exploitative system of the British. Now, again, before going into this article, it's important to understand who has written this and what are their point of views. This is written by G. Kishan Reddy, who is the current BJP minister for tourism, culture and development of Northeast region. Meaning that This article will give you a point of view of the government only. So this article essentially tells you what exactly has a Modi government done for the welfare of the tribal community. And the article also criticizes the previous UPA government, saying that they did not do anything. As expected, the minister did not give a point of view or initiatives of the previous government in this article. So don't worry about that. We are here to give that to you. As per the article, the government since 2014 has taken a lot of steps for bringing the tribal population into the mainstream. The author says that India has had a rich history of peaceful and helpful relations between those who are living in the forest and those who have been living in the cities. However, this balance was disturbed when the British came here. In 1871, the British passed the Criminal Tribes Act, which essentially said that the tribes living in the forest are criminals and they have to be arrested. This was mainly done because when the British were trying to exploit the resources of rural areas in India, when the British were trying to capture land, they faced a lot of opposition from the tribal community. In fact, some of the first resistance that the British faced in India was only through the tribals. So, to control this tribal fight, to ensure that they are not strong enough, the British passed this law which essentially said that all the tribal population are criminals and must be arrested. The British also passed the Forest Act of 1927. Before this act, everything that was being grown in the forest belonged to the tribal community because they used to live there for many centuries. But the Forest Act of 1927 essentially said that the government will decide who owns the forest produce and not the tribals. Now, the minister in this article says that the present government has taken a lot of steps, including having 8 ministers from the scheduled tribes after the recent cabinet expansion, including 3 scheduled tribes minister amongst the cabinet itself. This is a big step because usually in the Union Council of Ministers, there was a very little representation of the scheduled tribes. The article also says that the budget allocation to the Tribal Affairs Ministry has increased considerably and has reached above 7,500 crore for this year. The National Education Policy also says that children should be taught in their mother tongue at least till class 5th. This would also allow the scheduled tribe population, which is about 10% of India's total population, to prosper much more and to carry on with their culture. The government has also taken steps to establish 10 tribal freedom fighter museums because somewhere down the line, the contribution of tribals in India's freedom fight has been overlooked for many decades now, which is a fact. Most importantly, the minister says that the government amended the Forest Act of 1927 in 2017 and ensured that bamboo will no longer be classified as a tree. With this change, since bamboo now comes into the category of the grass, the forest dwellers are now free to use it as per their own requirement without waiting for the permission from government authorities. This will allow the tribals to use bamboo for a lot of applications, including arts and craft, including building their own houses, including in all other day to day activities where bamboo has been used historically in large numbers. Now, going beyond this article, there are a lot of other initiatives that the present and the past governments have taken. For example, the Eklavya Model Residential Schools. In this year's budget, the government said that we will be increasing the number of Eklavya Model Residential Schools. These are essentially schools for the tribal students where they would be given best form of education. Then the government has also launched the Van Bandhu Kalyan Yojana, under which the people living in the forest will be given better employment opportunities. The government will look into their social and economic development. The next is Sankalp Se Siddhi Van Dhan Yojana, under which the government is trying to promote products made by the tribal community using their own crafts and bringing it to the mainstream. The Tri-Food scheme is also run by TriFed in association with the Ministry of Food Processing Industry so that the minor produce in the forest areas can be utilized much better by the tribal community and the products can be sold online to the other people around the country. The government also launched the Goal scheme which stands for Going Online for Leader, under which the tribal youth will be given mentorship by leaders from different fields, allowing them to make a career in diverse fields. Over here, there's also a very interesting story of Jaipal Singh Munda, which I thought of sharing with you. Now, Jaipal Singh Munda had a very colorful career. He was the captain of India's hockey team that won the first Olympic gold medal in 1928. He was a tribal leader and one of the first people to actually make the demand for a separate state of Jharkhand. Later on, he even became a member of India's Constituent Assembly. Now, this is where the interesting story begins. In the Constituent Assembly, Mahatma Gandhi was not a member, but there were many people in the assembly who said that to respect Mahatma Gandhi, we should ban alcohol in India. In the entire country, alcohol should not be sold. Now, when such kind of a demand is made, it is very difficult to oppose this demand, even if you don't want to support it, especially when it comes with the name of Mahatma Gandhi. In this debate, it was Jaipal Singh Munda who got up and said that we are Adivasis and having rice beer is a part of our culture. There is no festival or occasion that we can celebrate without having a traditional rice beer. So we do not support banning alcohol at an all India level. And it is because of his effort that alcohol was not banned. So those of you who want to thank him for that can do that today. The next news item that I wanted to discuss is not an article per se, but it is an infographics from today's Hindu newspaper that talks about gender imbalance in the climate talks. In the recently concluded climate summit at Glasgow, the participation of women, not just from India, but from nations throughout the world, was much lower as compared to the males. The infographics tells us only 17% of Indian delegation that participated in the summit were women. And unfortunately, it is the same with most other countries. Out of the 195 nations that participated, only 35 nations had teams where women made up more than 50% of the delegation. In fact, so far, in all the climate change summits that have taken place, India's delegation has never had more than 33% women. That was in the last COP25 and COP23. It has been seen that richer nations, the nations with more GDP per capita income, tend to send more women as compared to the others. Not just women participation, even the time that was allotted for women speakers was much lower as compared to those given for male speakers on an average. Now, what does it signify? First, it unfortunately signifies the lack of importance given to women leaders. Secondly, it also highlights our lack of understanding that women face much bigger problems due to climate change. There have been multiple studies and reports that have highlighted how women across the world are at a much greater danger as compared to males due to the negative impact of climate change. And today we will discuss some of these reports. Now let's talk about women, especially in the developing and in the poor nations. In most of the developing nations of Asia and Africa, women are non working members of the household. So while the males go outside to earn money, women are expected to be at home, arrange for food, arrange for water, take care of the other family members. In many African countries, women have to travel far off just in order to arrange water for their daily needs. Now, with the decreasing size of freshwater lakes, with extinction of many water bodies, women now have to travel much farther distances, have had to do much more work in order to arrange for water. The UN report says that 70% of the world's poor are women, which would have a much drastic impact in cases of floods or drought. In fact, Oxfam report says that in the 2004 tsunami that impacted India also, the number of women who survived were much lower as compared to the men who managed to survive the same situation. Let me give you a very simple example of how women are impacted more and how their lives are in much more danger. Now, Bangladesh, because of its low lying geography, is a country that has faced the problem of floods for many decades now. Their arrangements to fight against cyclones and floods have drastically improved, but in the 1980s and 1990s, that was not the case. So in the 1990s and the early 2000s, what the government did was government used to send warning messages to the mobile phones of the people saying that we are expecting floods or cyclones. Now, in the late 1990s or in the first decade of the 2000s, especially in poor places, there used to be only one mobile phone, and that used to be with the male person of the family. Usually, these males used to go out to work, leaving the female in the family in the villages. These warning messages just used to go to the male member's mobile phone, and in many cases, the females back in the villages were not even told about the warning signals that came in from the government about floods or cyclones, resulting in much more deaths amongst women as compared to men. Thankfully, that situation has changed, but even today, in most of the developing nations, women are at a much higher danger because of these reasons. In many African nations, women still don't have the right to own property. They still work on other lands in order to sustain their family, which makes them much more susceptible as compared to the males. Now, has the government of India done something in this regard? From 2005 onwards, the government of India started a concept called gender budgeting. Gender budgeting means when the budget was announced, the government of India said that a certain part of the budget will be spent specifically for the welfare of women. Now, this was claimed to be a great idea when it started in 2005. But this snippet shows you if it has changed anything or not. In the last 13 years, the budget given for gender budgeting schemes has remained almost the same. While the total budget of the government has increased from 5 lakh crore to almost 30 lakh crore, the budget given for gender schemes is still about 1.4 lakh crore only. So the proportion of budget that is focused on gender related schemes has still remained same in the vicinity of 4 to 5.5%, which is not a very encouraging step. It is again one of those initiatives which make a lot of news when they are introduced, but they are soon forgotten, unfortunately. The next article that we have is about the CAG. The Prime Minister yesterday said that the CAG does not have any conflict with the center government, and the center government and the CAG now work together. However, the reality might seem to be slightly different. In the past decade or so, the office of the CAG has been in the news for all the wrong reasons. Let's discuss some of them. As you would know, the CAG is a constitutional position and has to work as a guardian of the public purse. The CAG essentially audits the accounts of the government and has a responsibility to bring to the light if there has been any corruption from the side of the government or if the government has misused the public money. Thus, the CAG is supposed to be an extremely important office which has to keep the government accountable. Similar office is found in many countries throughout the world. UK, Germany, Japan, US, most of these nations have an office similar to that of the CAG. However, in India, the appointment process of the CAG is very different as compared to other nations. In India, the CAG is appointed by the President of India on the advice of the Council of Ministers, meaning that there is absolute no role of the opposition, no committee is formed, the judiciary does not have any role. The government has a free hand in appointing anyone as the CAG since there is no clear eligibility criteria that is mentioned in the constitution, thus leading to situations where appointment of the CAG becomes extremely controversial. And I will discuss some of the examples also. Recently, just a couple of weeks back, the ex-CAG of India, Vinod Rai, famously apologized to Sanjay Nirupam. Vinod Rai was a CAG at the time of the UPA government when Dr. Manmohan Singh was the Prime Minister. Vinod Rai was a CAG who gave a lot of reports such as the 2G scam, and he talked about scams of unheard proportions. He said that the scams are worth 1.5 lakh crore and much more. In one of the interviews, the CAG had said earlier that Congress leader Sanjay Nirupam had requested the CAG not to take the name of Dr. Manmohan Singh in any of the reports. Sanjay Nirupam said, "This has never happened. I have never even met the CAG." Vinod Rai, now just a couple of weeks back, said, "Sorry, I was wrong. It was a lie. I have never met Sanjay Nirupam. He never said, don't take the name of Dr. Manmohan Singh." Now imagine the CAG saying all these things in the media that the politicians met me, they said, don't take this name and that name. And then after so many years, just coming in and saying, oh, sorry, I was mistaken. Doesn't it hamper the credibility of the office of the CAG? You can't just speak anything and then come back later and just say, sorry, no, I was mistaken. Issues such as these, along with the appointment process, have resulted in a lot of debate about the office of the CAG. Not just this. When Vinod Rai was a CAG, as I said, he gave a lot of reports which led to the unearthing of 2G scam. However, in reality, there is no one in the jail for this 2G scam. The courts, in fact, said that there is no proof that this scam happened. So, all those big reports of the CAG during the UPA government, which led to the Congress becoming the corrupt party in the eyes of millions of people, have not been proven correct. But there is no accountability of the CAG. The CAG does not have to come and explain himself or herself. That is what has led to all this controversy. Now, as I said, the biggest and the first issue with the CAG is the appointment. The CAG is an extremely powerful office. Dr. Rajendra Prasad had said that CAG has the power to call to account any officer, irrespective of his or her position, if it concerns the money of the state. But India is the only democratic country in the world where an office like the CAG is appointed by the executive. That is, there is no role of the parliament, there is no role of the opposition parties. The governments just appoint anyone that they want. Countries such as Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Britain, even US have a system where the parliament has a role to play, where the public account committee has to certify whether or not to appoint this person as a CAG. But in India, that has never happened. There have been multiple instances of appointment of CAG becoming controversial. In 2013, Shashikant Sharma was being appointed as a CAG. He used to work as a defense secretary and had worked on many sensitive cases. Many people filed a PIL in the Supreme Court, but nothing was done against it. I'm taking this example to highlight the fact that it is not just about one political party. The BJP came to power in 2014, but in 2013, the same thing was happening. Whichever party comes to power works in the similar manner. In 2017, the Common Cause in Indian Audit and Accounts Retired Officers Association submitted a memorandum to Prime Minister and Finance Minister saying that the appointment of CAG should be much more transparent. But the government said, oh please, we'll appoint whoever that we want. And the government went ahead and appointed Rajiv Mehrishi, who used to work as a Home Secretary and was considered as very close to the government. During his tenure, the number of audit reports that were submitted to the parliament were very low. It is said that he changed a lot of information in the audit reports. He did not permit a lot of paragraphs to be included in the reports, which would have been against the government. This again begs the question whether the CAG is serving the government or the CAG is serving the public as he is supposed to. But so far, no such change has happened or is expected. The next article is about the decision of Tamil Nadu government to appeal in the Supreme Court to restore the 1 year quota in the state. So the story is that the Tamil Nadu government had given 20% quota to the most backward classes in government jobs and higher education institutions. Sometime back, out of this 20%, 10.5% were reserved specifically for the 1 year community. This decision of the government was challenged in the Madras High Court, and the Madras High Court said that the Tamil Nadu government decision is wrong, it is against the constitution, since there is no quantifiable data to suggest that this percentage of reservation should be given to the 1 year community. The court said that the government has not carried out any authentic research on the basis of which this reservation is given to the 1 years. The Tamil Nadu government has now decided to approach the Supreme Court in this matter. Now, Tamil Nadu state and reservation are two topics that go hand in hand. The reservation policy of the state of Tamil Nadu is pretty unique and different as compared to the other states. In fact, the state of Tamil Nadu right now has 69% reservation as against the Supreme Court limit of 50%. We'll also discuss how exactly is that allowed. Now let's take a step back and talk about the Vanyar movement. Now the Vanyars make up one of the largest backward communities in the state, and they have been demanding reservation since the 1980s. Their demand was that they want 20% reservation just for their caste in the state of Tamil Nadu and 2% in the central services. This movement reached its peak in the mid 1980s when a lot of supporters sent letters to the chief minister. When the government saw no other option, they asked the police to control the situation, leading to a lot of violence and death of 21 protesters in 1987. Under this political pressure, the state government of Tamil Nadu finally decided that the OBC reservation quota in the state will be divided into two parts. One, the backward caste, and other, the most backward caste. In the most backward caste category, there were 107 communities along with the Vanyars. So a total of 108 communities were told that you will have to share the most backward caste quota. But the Vanyars were not happy. They wanted their own specific quota to be given to them. And that is why, from the 20% most backward caste quota, they were told, okay, 10.5% is given specifically to you. This is the background of the entire controversy. Now, why was this decision challenged in the Madras High Court? It was challenged on two grounds. Number one, the state government does not have any proof to say that this number is ideal to be given to the Vanyar community. Second, the decision was taken just a few hours before the model code of conduct had to start because of the elections. So, what was the hurry to take such a decision? These were the two grounds on which the matter was challenged in the Madras High Court. The government of Tamil Nadu, on the other hand, have their own arguments. They say that as the elected government, they can make any law whenever they want. Even if it is 1 minute before the model code of conduct, what is the harm in that? If the tenure of the prime minister, for example, is 5 years, you don't tell him that, sir, only 5 minutes are remaining, please don't take any more decision. 5 years means 5 years. So you can't say that the government has taken a decision in the last minute, so it should not be counted. Secondly, Tamil Nadu government says that in 2020, we did set up a commission for 6 months to give us quantifiable data on different castes and communities and tribes in the state. But within the 6 month tenure, the commission could not submit the report. And the government thought that because of the urgency of the matter, we must go ahead and provide the reservation. So we did that. So you can't argue that we did not try to get any quantifiable data. But Madras High Court did not listen to it. The Madras High Court said that you should have waited for the data to come in, and that is why they said that the decision of the Tamil Nadu government is against the constitution, leading to the Tamil Nadu government having to go to the Supreme Court for this matter. Now, a bit of history about why exactly is the Tamil Nadu government allowed to have 69% reservation in the state when the Supreme Court itself in the Indra Sahni case said that the reservation should not breach the 50% limit. As I said, Tamil Nadu politics goes hand in hand with the reservation policy. Till the beginning of 1970s, the Tamil Nadu government had a total reservation of 41%. After the 1970s, in the mid 1970s, now there started to be a race between the two political parties, that is the DMK and AIADMK, about who can give more reservation to their supporters. DMK's leader M. Karunanidhi first increased the reservation to 49%, and then in 1980, when MG Ramachandran, the famous MGR, when he came to power and became the chief minister, he further increased the reservation and it became 68%. In 1990, again, when DMK came to power, they said, okay, we'll increase it by one more, and they made it 69%. Now, how is it that the judiciary allowed it? So in 1992, when the Supreme Court said in the Indira Sahani case that the reservation should not go beyond 50%, the Tamil Nadu government went to the Madras High Court saying that the admissions to colleges have already started. So please allow us this reservation policy at least for one more year. So Madras High Court said, okay, you can have 69% reservation for this year, but in the next academic year, that is 1994-95, when the colleges start, before that you have to bring down your reservation to 50%. In between, the Tamil Nadu government went to the Supreme Court because if we change it now in the midway, a lot of students' career will be destroyed. In the meanwhile, the Tamil Nadu government also went to the President of India, requested the President of India to give assent to their reservation bill, and they requested the center government to place their reservation law in the ninth schedule. As you know, any law placed in the ninth schedule cannot be struck down by the judiciary. So the reservation law of the Tamil Nadu government, number one, was given assent by the President of India also. And second, it is placed in the ninth schedule as well, which gives protection to this law against judicial review. And that is how the reservation law of Tamil Nadu has continued. Over the years, the Supreme Court has said specifically in the IR Kohlo case that the law placed in the ninth schedule will also be challenged and cannot be overlooked by the judiciary. Thus, this decision of 69% reservation of Tamil Nadu is still pending in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court will hear the matter in the coming time. So the policy of 69% reservation might change in the coming years, but it remains to be seen. These were the important articles from today's Hindu newspaper. Now, a couple of practice questions. Number one, is India right in going ahead with the purchase of S-400 missile defense system from Russia despite the fears of US sanctions? Give reasons to support your argument. Second, enlist the various initiatives taken by the government to bring India's tribal population into the mainstream and evaluate the success of such initiatives. Both of these questions have to be answered within 250 words each. Thank you so much for watching the video.